Hey everybody, this is your Uncharted 4 review with Canadian Matt and American Matt.
Hello.
This is our normal format for reviews where one has played it and usually the other person hasn't. So you have the thoughts of someone who has played the game in and out, someone who hasn't. Hopefully, those of you that are listening, sometimes you're listening because you have played the game. I love to do that and hear reviews and hear other people's perspectives on it. And sometimes you're listening to see whether it's worth playing. And after this, we're going to be reviewing which game, Matt?
Umbrella Corps.
That's right. That's your line. Umbrella Corps, Capcom. No spoilers for that, but that will also be up on the site very soon. So, Uncharted 4. If you've ever played Uncharted 2 or 3 or 1 and you like that style of game, I think it's a no brainer. This game is pretty easy to recommend. How it compares to those games, the scope is a little bit smaller, but it goes a lot deeper, and it is very obvious that the writers and the makers of this game have grown up. The same way that Naughty Dog evolved their storytelling with The Last of Us, focusing more on a father daughter relationship, having a middle aged character, having more weaknesses and flaws. This is something we see a lot more in this game. The storytelling is superb, and from someone myself, I loved Uncharted 2 and 3 and really didn't care for the story. There were some moments that happened that I thought were really interesting, but I would generally skip through most of the beginning cutscenes, and I watched a few near the end, but I actually liked it just for the straight up gameplay and the big set pieces that were so fun. Uncharted 4, however, I was right in on the story immediately, which is tough for me in a lot of games, but I was clicked in right away. They do a great job of introducing some villains, and when they come back later on, there is so much punch to it. They do a great job of setting the stakes. What's going on with the new characters that are coming? Three new characters that are brought in are all really, really well done, and I'd say are some of my favorite in the whole series now. If you haven't played an Uncharted game before, I really recommend you go back. 2 and 3 still really, really hold up. 1 you could skip and you could watch the cutscenes, and I think you'd be just fine. But 2 and 3 are still really great. They still look really good. You can grab them on PS4 and the Uncharted Collection or PS3. And I think it would, while you could still enjoy Uncharted 4 without it, they do a really good job of letting you know what's happening, and there are new characters and a new focal point. If you have played those other games, I think you'll get a lot of the nostalgia out of it. I mean, it's like someone made a really good point. It's like Star Wars, The Force Awakens. I mean, you don't need to have watched the earlier ones, but if you have, it's pretty cool when you see Harrison Ford and Peter Mayhew, the actor who portrays Chewbacca. So, let's get into it now. The game is basically comprised into story elements, walking around, kind of walking and talking, setting that up very Last of Us style. There's a lot of light platforming, a lot of heavy platforming, and then you have your combat scenes, you have your story sequences, and then you have sort of the big Uncharted set pieces that are kind of like Crash Bandicoot taken to the millionth degree, running away from giant boulders, things crumbling all around you. So I'd say, first off, let's get to the weak points of it. The combat, like the combat in all Uncharted games, is not great. And a lot of times it seems a little too long. Sometimes you come into these areas, these big open areas, and you just think, oh no, I see all these places where I'm supposed to hide and where they're going to hide. I'm going to be tackling like 30 bad guys. It's kind of ridiculous. And in those moments, it can really drag on. It can be kind of difficult. I've heard some people play on an easier difficulty, and they say it actually suits the tone of the game and the series a bit more. Like Indiana Jones just one-shots everybody. So putting it on easy, I think, is a good way to go through the game. I'm doing that with Mass Effect 1 right now, and I really, really enjoy it. It lets you get to what is better about the game. There are some combat sequences that are really well done, ones that are a lot faster, that maybe involve some vehicles here and there, that are just keeping it moving forward. But when it goes back on this, here's some cover, here's a ton of enemies, and tries to be Gears of War, that's where I think it falters a bit and will be the most tedious parts of the game, where you're just kind of waiting for it to be over. There were a few frustrating sequences where I just died over and over again because I think I got frustrated and wanted to rush. And they also removed a mechanic. In Uncharted 3, you could throw back grenades. In this one, the toughest enemies throw tons of grenades, and for some reason, they took it out of the game. So that kind of blows me away. But really, the game is about the story, the set pieces, and the presentation. There are so many moments in this game, presentation speaking, where like the facial animations and the facial acting they get out of these characters is probably the best I've ever seen.
Hmm.
I'd be pretty confident in saying that, and it's really the main difference when comparing games on a PS4 to a PS3, right? It's just that extra level of detail. We're still playing the same type of games, but the PS4 lets you go even further into it. So what they've done there is really well, and it really works hand in hand with the better storytelling and the backstory that they have.
You know what? Let me interrupt real quick, just because you're fresh off talking about the gameplay and the shooting and how some of the more challenging or intense combat sequences were the most disappointing parts of the game for you. Because I remember when we were talking about your first impressions earlier about the game, I brought up the point because I had heard several people mention that at certain points of the game, it almost felt like a walking simulator. Like so much of the gameplay focus was focused on just getting, slowly from one point to the next so that your characters have time to banter. It was more about the cutscenes and the dialogue and, getting deeper into the character stories. But now it's almost sounding like those are the parts of the game that you were dying to get to, and that the combat and what most people, if they've never played an Uncharted game, just your average bro, frat bro who plays, Call of Duty and Madden, like they probably want to go into a game for like really great shooting action and stuff like that, and maybe some of those heavier platforming elements. But would you say that the highlight of this game, or possibly the series as a whole, are maybe those segments of the game that people are that come to mind when they accuse us of being almost a walking sim type game? Is that kind of the highlight for you?
I'd say it's right up there. I mean, definitely the best thing Uncharted does are the giant set pieces and the moments where you can't believe this isn't a game. The Indiana Jones escaping type moments. I don't want to spoil any of them at all, but I've heard some people say that there weren't too many of those in this game, but they show up. They may not be as many that are as large of scope as the train in Uncharted 2 or a plane or a cruise ship in Uncharted 3, but they're still there. Those are definitely the highlights. But yeah, I really enjoyed the walking around, and just like The Last of Us, they use the same mechanic of working with somebody to get through a level. You're always sort of keeping busy. You're enjoying the vistas and doing some platforming or using a jeep and sort of finding a way through an area. And I think those are necessary parts because they slow it down and they let you build, but they do it in a very like super polished Naughty Dog way where the conversation is great, the acting is great, and they're filling in a lot of the story and letting you care about it and focusing on the relationships. Um, I'm not going to say any of them at all, but yeah, I'd say that was probably my second favorite part of it. I mean, you got your set pieces up here, you got the walking sim, if you want to call it that, and then yeah, the combat was a little bit lower.
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
I was also going to ask. You mentioned going through Uncharted 2 and 3 that the cutscenes sometimes were things that you just kind of breeze through as you were trying to get through the game, and how Uncharted 4 kind of has its own story focus, its new characters, this villain reveal. Obviously, for nostalgia purposes, like you mentioned, playing through previous games is something that would enhance the experience of going through Uncharted 4. But having played through 1, 2, and 3, not caring so much about the story, and then playing through this grand finale rather, and kind of tying up all those loose ends. Um, do you feel like that story was given a greater emphasis in this fourth game just because they knew they were kind of closing everything out? Do you think that story in Uncharted 4 is better or of a higher quality than 2 and 3? Like something that you can ignore, something you would not want to breeze through? Did they really step up their game here? Or do you think you just cared more because you knew it was the last one?
I feel like they've learned a lot, and I think it's a combination of them wanting to finish it off on a bang. Neil Druckmann has said he wants to burn the house down on the way out, and I think that led a lot of people to thinking we're going to see some big major character deaths, things they've hinted at in other games. Even the cover of Uncharted is like a very kind of gloomy look to it, but I would say that just straight up the story is a lot better. It's a lot better done, and a lot of the gameplay, excuse me, revolves around that story, and these sort of walking sim moments help flesh that out. And I mean, there's certain sections in the game that are basically you playing through story in a way with something that could have been just told. So
Mm-hmm.
now with the earlier games, even though I had breezed through a few of the cutscenes, the moments that maybe people might call a walking sim or a climbing sim or a platforming sim, where you're talking and bantering with these people. I mean, those are some of that's where a lot of the great writing in the game lies. When you are expecting just to be platforming and playing and gaming around, the banter that exists between the characters is like genuinely laugh out loud funny, which I cannot say for very many games.
Yeah.
And even skipping a lot of those cutscenes in the earlier ones, I still built up of enough of fondness for characters like Sully and Elena and Drake, the earlier ones, that to see them in this one and actually watch the cutscenes a lot more hits home a lot more.
Hmm.
The platforming is what you would expect from an Uncharted game. The same. I mean, the first couple times you play Uncharted, it's a real surprise when you jump on something and things crumble around you. Now you're starting to really get to know.
Yeah.
You're like, I bet you anything that thing's going to crumble down. A nice mechanic they added was the grappling hook, and I think it's a perfect extension of what Drake does. And there's a lot of cool moments where you're sliding down and you're going to fall to your death, and just to jump out, and the grappling hook lets you reach distances and heights that you weren't able to before, and I think it's the perfect addition for the game. They might abuse the sliding mechanic a lot in the game. I think they wanted to teach you quite a bit, and then they just seem to really go hog wild with it, especially in one of the sections. But I still enjoyed it. It might have been a little too much at times, but it's the platforming is as good as you might remember it. A big improvement is the puzzles. I found some of the puzzling sections in Uncharted 3 really bogged down the action quite a bit. It might have been a bit obtuse for my brain to figure out. I feel like the puzzles are a little less frequent and I found them a lot more satisfying in this iteration. They weren't as long, they weren't as deep to figure out, and they seemed to make a lot more sense. So maybe they dialed them down a bit. Maybe I just understood the language of it a little bit more, but the puzzle's definitely a little better. The melee combat, I had talked about that on our last impressions review, and I'd said that I really didn't like that they didn't have a sort of a Batman Rocksteady timing mechanic with it, where it was basically just hammer the attack button and then wait until you're in trouble and then hit the defensive button. And they leave it up to you to decide that, which is kind of interesting. It takes away some of the timing and the ability to get through a melee battle unscathed. A nice addition they did add was the double team, and if you have an ally nearby, if you attack the same one, that's basically an invincible attack and sort of a one-hit knockdown. So that's a nice way to include the allies, have a cool animation, but also do it in a strategic way. So that I enjoyed. Matt, I put in a section here for you, the extras. There are some unlockables, and there's a lot of hidden loot.
Oh.
So yeah, a great thing they do is that it's very easy in a game like this to make the environment feel like, well, there's only really one path you can have, right? It's linear. But they did a great job of including a lot of sort of false areas you could go down, a lot of dead ends that are just long enough that it feels like natural. And there were many, many times where I just sort of explored a different area, went in, saw that it was a dead end. It wasn't the real way, but it made the environment feel a lot more alive, and more often than not, there would be a nice little secret there, a little treasure you could find. It lets you examine it. And the game mentioned, although I didn't get too into it because I'm not really a big loot guy, that can unlock certain things. So there's a bit of replay encouragement to go find some of these other pieces in the nooks and the cranberries. But really, the biggest moments are the giant set pieces, and they do a couple new things with them. They may not be as large and as sort of natural disaster-esque as the earlier ones, but there are definitely some moments in here that I would go back and play through the chapter if I still owned the game and I didn't sell it to somebody. So overall, I would highly recommend it, whether you've played Uncharted or not. If you have no idea whether you like this kind of game, it's a nice short experience with great storytelling, pretty decent platforming, decent combat, and probably the best character acting you're ever going to see, and animation acting in a video game. So I'll give it an 11 out of 12.
And play through the story, just because the story in the series is so important to the industry as a whole, to Sony especially. Obviously, the multiplayer, you sold your copy, so maybe not a game that you want to go spend $60 on right away that you're going to keep forever, but definitely just, if nothing else, to keep up with the industry zeitgeist and have this story be a part of your life. Get it from Redbox or anywhere you can rent this game. buy it, play through the story, sell it back. Worth playing at all costs, but not necessarily worth going out spending $60 on right away to keep forever. Is that fair to say?
Well, I mean, I think it's worth the full price.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. I don't know if you have to keep it forever. I mean, I've played the multiplayer with you and it's fine, but
Yeah.
when you have games like Overwatch and Rainbow Six, why bother with the multiplayer of a game where it's just like so tacked on? And it was fine. It was definitely fun, but I mean, play Overwatch, man.
Yeah.
Just play
I hear you.
Overwatch.